If you ever feel your world collapsing, pray the wrong person doesn't answer your call, because that's exactly what happened to me. The rain hit first, loud and relentless, drumming against the cracked sidewalk like it was trying to erase everything that had just happened. But it couldn't erase the way my ribs screamed every time I tried to breathe, shallow, uneven, like my body had forgotten how to do something so simple, so human. And I remember thinking, not clearly, not logically, just a flicker of thought cutting through the pain. This is how people disappear, not in explosions or headlines, but quietly, on a street no one looks twice at, while the city keeps moving like nothing matters. And he was already gone, footsteps fading, leaving behind nothing but the echo of what I refused to name, because naming it would make it real, and I couldn't afford that. Not right now. Not when I could barely keep my eyes open. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, slick with rain, fingers numb, screen cracked from when it hit the ground. And I didn't even know who I was trying to reach. I just typed, "Please, help me." The letters blurring together, my vision swimming, my thumb hovering for half a second before pressing send. And that was it. That was the mistake, the kind that doesn't feel like one until it's too late. Because somewhere across the city, miles away from the broken streetlight flickering above me, a man stopped mid-sentence, and I didn't see it, didn't hear it, but I felt something shift, like the air itself had changed, like the night had taken a breath it wasn't supposed to take. My phone buzzed in my hand, sharp and sudden, making me flinch, and for a second I thought it was him, that he'd come back, that this wasn't over. But when I forced my eyes to focus, all I saw was a single message, 3 words that didn't belong to anyone I knew. Stay right there. And something about it was wrong. Not the words, but the way they sat on the screen, steady, certain, like they weren't a suggestion, like they were a command. And I should have been scared. Maybe I was, but the fear came. Second to the exhaustion pulling me under, the cold seeping through my clothes, into my bones. I tried to move, just a little, just enough to sit up, but the world tilted hard, and I let out a breath that shook more than I wanted it to. "Okay," I whispered, though no one was there to hear it. "Okay, I'll stay, because what else was I supposed to do?" And then time did something strange. It stretched and folded in on itself, seconds turning into something heavier, something slower, until I heard it, distant at first, then closer. The low growl of engines cutting through the rain, not one, but several, smooth, controlled, nothing like the chaotic noise of the city. Headlights sliced through the darkness, too bright, too focused, and even through the haze in my mind, I knew these weren't random cars. They didn't hesitate, didn't slow until they reached me. Doors opened in unison, precise, practiced, and suddenly the street that had felt so empty wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with something I couldn't name, something heavy, like power you don't question because you know better. Footsteps approached, measured, unhurried, and I forced my head up, every muscle protesting, just enough to see him, tall, composed, untouched by the rain in a way that didn't make sense, like the storm had decided not to touch him, his coat dark, perfectly fitted, his presence sharper than the cold air. And when his eyes found mine, everything else fell away, the noise, the pain, even the fear, because there was something in that look that didn't ask, didn't doubt. It assessed, it decided, and I realized, too late, that I hadn't just sent a message into the void. I had reached someone who answered with certainty, someone who didn't hesitate. And as he stepped closer, crouching just enough to bring himself into my line of sight, his voice low, controlled, carrying through the rain like it belonged to it, he said, "Who did this to you?" And I didn't know why, but in that moment, with everything falling apart around me, it felt less like a question and more like a promise. I tried to answer him, but my voice did not come out the way I expected. It came out small, unsteady, like it belonged to someone else entirely. And for a second I hated that. Hated how weak I sounded in front of a man who looked like he had never been anything but in control. I swallowed hard, forcing air into my lungs even though it hurt, every breath shallow and tight. I do not know," I said, and it was not entirely a lie, because saying his name felt like giving him power he did not deserve. The man in front of me did not react the way people usually did when they heard uncertainty. He did not press, did not raise his voice, did not even look impatient. He just studied me, his eyes moving over my face, my shoulders, the way I was holding myself like I was trying to stay in one piece. And something in his expression shifted, subtle, but real, like he had already decided something I was not part of. "You are freezing," he said quietly, and before I could respond, his coat was around me, heavy, warm, carrying a scent that was clean but sharp, something expensive, something that did not belong anywhere near a street like this. I flinched at the sudden weight, not because it hurt, but because I was not used to someone noticing, not like that, not without expecting something in return. "I am fine," I whispered automatically, the words coming out of habit, the same lie I had been telling myself for months. But he did not acknowledge it, did not argue. He simply reached for his phone, spoke a few words in a language I did not recognize, low and precise, and everything around him responded. The men who had stepped out of the vehicles moved without hesitation, one of them already scanning the street, another speaking into an earpiece. And I realized then that whatever world he came from, it did not operate on chance, it operated on decisions. "Fast and final, can you stand?" he asked, his attention returning to me, and I hesitated, because the honest answer was no. But something about the way he was looking at me made me try anyway. I pushed my hands against the pavement, forcing myself upright, the world tilting dangerously as I did, my knees barely holding, and I would have fallen if his hand had not closed around my arm, steady, firm, but careful. Nothing like the grip I was used to, nothing that left marks or demanded submission. This was control without pressure, strength without force, and it confused me more than it should have. "Easy," he said, his voice softer now, like he was speaking to something fragile, and I hated that word, hated what it implied, but I could not deny the way my body leaned into the support despite everything in me telling me not to trust it, not to trust him. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because suddenly the situation felt too big, too unreal. Strangers in black suits, a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of a magazine, but carried something darker beneath the surface, cars that did not belong in this neighborhood, and me, standing in the middle of it like I had stepped into the wrong story. His gaze met mine again, steady, unreadable. "Somewhere warm," he said simply, like that was the only detail that mattered. And maybe it should have been, but my mind was already racing, already trying to catch up to everything that was happening. "I cannot go with you," I said quickly, the words sharper than I intended, panic threading through them. "I do not even know who you are." There was a brief pause, not long, just enough for something unspoken to settle between us. And then, slowly, almost like it was not important, he said, "Adrian," just his name, nothing more, no explanation, no reassurance. Just a fact placed in front of me like it should mean something. And the strange part was, it did. I did not know why, but it did. Before I could respond, one of the men approached, speaking quietly to him. Something about the area, about time, about risk. Words I only caught pieces of. Adrian listened without looking away from me, and then gave a small nod, the kind that ended conversations instead of continuing them. "We are leaving," he said, not to me, but to everyone, and everything moved. Again, fast, efficient, like a machine that had already calculated the outcome. I felt the shift before it happened, the moment where I either stepped back into the life I knew or forward into something I did not understand, and neither option felt safe, neither felt real. "Emily," he said suddenly, and my heart stuttered, because I had not told him my name. I knew I had not. I would remember that. I would remember giving that piece of myself away. But he said it like he had always known, like it belonged to him as much as it did to me. "Look at me," he added, and I did, because something in his voice made it impossible not to. "You are not going back there tonight," he said, calm, certain, not a question, not a suggestion, and I realized then that whatever line I had crossed when I sent that message, there was no stepping back over it, because this man did not step into situations halfway. And as he guided me toward the waiting car, the rain still falling around us, the city still moving like nothing had changed, I understood one thing with terrifying clarity. I had not just asked for help. I had handed my life to someone who did not give it back easily. The car door closed with a soft, final sound that felt louder than anything else that night, like a line being drawn that I could not step back over. The warmth hit me immediately, controlled and precise, nothing like the chaotic cold outside, And for a second my body reacted before my mind did, muscles loosening just enough to betray how exhausted I really was. I sat there, still, unsure where to put my hands, unsure where to look, because everything about the interior was too clean, too quiet. Leather seats without a single crease, faint lighting that made the space feel smaller, more contained. And then there was him, sitting across from me, not touching, not crowding, just there, watching, always watching, as if every small movement I made mattered more than I understood. I pulled his coat tighter around me without thinking, the fabric heavy on my shoulders, grounding in a way I did not expect. And that was when it hit me. This was real. None of this was something I could wake up from. I was in a car with a man I did not know, being taken somewhere I had not agreed to, and yet I had not said no. Not really, because something in me had already accepted that staying where I was had not been an option. "You are very quiet," Adrian said after a moment, his voice low, calm, cutting through the silence without disturbing it. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding, my fingers tightening slightly in the fabric of his coat. "I am thinking," I replied, my voice steadier now, but still carrying the edge of something fragile. He tilted his head just slightly, like he was considering that answer, like it was something he needed to evaluate. "About what?" he asked, and it should have been a simple question, but it was not. Not in this space, not with him, because the truth was complicated, layered, messy, and I did not even know where to start. "About how I ended up here," I said, finally, choosing the part that felt safest to say out loud. His gaze did not shift, did not soften, but there was something there, something quieter beneath the surface. "You asked for help," he said, like that explained everything, like that was the only piece that mattered. I shook my head slightly, the motion small but deliberate. "I sent a message," I corrected, because those two things were not the same. Not to me, not anymore. His lips curved just enough to suggest he understood the difference, even if he did not agree with it, and I answered. He replied, simple, direct, leaving no space for argument. The car moved smoothly through the city. I could feel it more than see it. The subtle turns, the steady acceleration, like we were gliding through streets that had no right to look so different from the inside of this vehicle. I caught glimpses through the tinted window, blurred lights, passing buildings. People who had no idea how close they were to something they would never understand. And for a moment, I wondered what I looked like from the outside. Just another shadow in the back seat of a black car, disappearing into a night that did not belong to me anymore. "You knew my name," I said suddenly, the question pressing forward before I could stop it, because it had been sitting there, heavy in my mind, ever since he said it. Adrian did not answer immediately, and that silence told me more than words would have. It told me that whatever the answer was, it was not simple, it was not accidental. "I know a lot of things," he said eventually, his tone unchanged, but the meaning behind it sharper now, more defined. I felt something twist in my chest that had nothing to do with the pain, something closer to unease, to realization. "That is not normal," I said quietly, because it needed to be said, because pretending otherwise would make this something it was not. He held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, and then, just as calmly, he said, "Neither is leaving you where I found you." And there it was again, that shift, that quiet redirection of reality, where his world made more sense than mine did, where his choices felt like the only logical outcome, even when they were not. I looked away first, my eyes dropping to my hands, still trembling slightly despite the warmth, despite the stillness. And I hated that he could see that, hated that nothing about this felt equal, felt balanced. "Where are we going?" I asked, the question softer now, less resistance, more need, because the truth was, I did want to know. I needed something solid to hold on to, something that made this feel less like I was drifting into something I could not control. Adrian leaned back slightly, the movement relaxed but deliberate, like everything he did had a purpose, somewhere safe, he said again. But this time the word carried more weight, more implication, and I realized then that safe, to him, did not mean the same thing it meant to me. Safe did not mean familiar. It did not mean comfortable. It meant controlled, protected, contained. And as the car slowed, turning into a street that looked nothing like the one I had left behind, buildings taller, quieter, guarded in ways I could not see but could feel, I understood that whatever came next was not going to be something I recognized, because when the car finally came to a stop, and one of the doors opened before I even reached for the handle, Adrian looked at me one more time, steady, certain, and said, "You are not alone anymore." And for reasons I could not explain, that did not feel like comfort. It felt like the beginning of something I was not ready for. I did not step out of the car right away, even when the door opened and the rain softened into a distant whisper against polished concrete, because the world outside did not look like a place I belonged. It looked untouched, controlled, like every detail had been decided long before I arrived. Tall glass walls reflecting city lights. A quiet entrance framed by dark stone. No noise, no chaos. Nothing like the street I had just left behind. And for a second I stayed exactly where I was, fingers tightening around the edge of the seat, because stepping out felt like agreeing to something I did not fully understand. "Emily," Adrian said, not louder, not sharper, just enough to pull me back, and I looked at him. Really looked this time, trying to find something human in the calm way he held himself, something uncertain, but there was nothing like that. Only control, only quiet certainty, like this moment had already been decided before I even sent that message. "You can walk, or I can carry you," he added, not as a threat, not even as pressure, just a fact. And I hated that those were the only two options he gave me. Hated that both of them led to the same place. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to move, to shift forward, my feet touching the ground with a slight tremor that I could not fully hide. The cold air hit my face, sharper now, clearer, and I pulled the coat tighter around me as I stepped out, every movement careful, measured, like my body was reminding me of its limits. One of the men closed the car door behind me without a sound. And just like that, the outside world felt farther away than it should have. Adrian moved beside me, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the presence of him, the quiet gravity that seemed to follow wherever he went. The entrance doors opened before we reached them. No hesitation, no delay, like someone had been watching, waiting, expecting us. And that thought settled somewhere deep in my chest, heavy and unsettling. Inside, the warmth was immediate, clean, the air carrying a faint scent of something subtle, something expensive. Marble floors stretched beneath my feet, reflecting soft lighting that made everything look sharper, more defined. And I suddenly became aware of how out of place I must look. Damp hair, borrowed coat, standing in a space that felt too perfect for someone like me. My steps slowed without me meaning them to, my eyes taking in everything. The quiet, the order, the absence of anything unpredictable. "This is not a hospital," I said before I could stop myself, because that had been the only thing in my mind, the only logical destination. Adrian glanced at me, a brief shift of attention that felt heavier than it should have. "No," he said simply, and that was it. No explanation, no reassurance, just the truth placed between us. My chest tightened slightly at that, not from pain, but from the realization that I had walked into something else entirely, something I did not have a name for yet. We moved toward the elevators, and again, everything seemed to respond before he asked. Doors opening, space clearing, silence following him like it belonged to him. I stepped inside, the mirrored walls catching my reflection for the first time, and I almost did not recognize myself. Pale, tired, eyes wide in a way that made me look younger than I felt, smaller than I wanted to be. I looked away quickly, focusing instead on the soft hum of the elevator as it moved upward, numbers lighting up one by one, each floor taking me farther from anything familiar. "You should sit when we get upstairs," Adrian said, his voice cutting through the quiet again, not unkind, but not gentle either, just practical, like he was stating something inevitable. I nodded without thinking, because arguing felt pointless, because part of me knew he was right. The elevator doors opened into another quiet space, darker this time, softer lighting, wide windows stretching across the far wall, showing the city from a height that made everything below look distant, almost unreal. I hesitated. Again, just for a second, because stepping into this place felt like crossing another line, one I could not uncross. Adrian noticed, of course he did. He noticed everything, but he did not rush me, did not push, he simply waited. And somehow that made it harder, because it made the choice feel like mine even when it was not. I stepped forward, the floor cool beneath my feet, the silence pressing in around me. And that was when it hit me, fully, completely. This was not temporary. This was not just help. This was something else, something deeper, something that came with rules I did not know yet. I turned to him, the question already forming before I could stop it. What happens now? My voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something searching, something uncertain. Adrian met my gaze without hesitation, without doubt, and for a brief second, something in his expression softened, just barely, like a shadow passing over something solid. Now, he said slowly, like he was choosing the words carefully, like they mattered more than I understood. You rest. And it should have sounded simple. It should have sounded safe. But the way he said it, the certainty behind it, made something in my chest tighten again, because rest, in his world, did not feel like an option. It felt like the beginning of something I was not ready to name. I did not move right away after he said that, because rest sounded simple. But nothing about this felt simple. Not the place, not him, not the way everything seemed to shift around his decisions, like the world itself adjusted to fit him. I stood there for a second too long, the silence stretching just enough to make me aware of it, aware of him still watching, always watching, and I forced myself to take another step forward, then another, until the space no longer felt like something I was standing outside of, but something I was already inside, already part of whether I wanted to be or not. The room opened wider as I moved, a living space that looked untouched, like no one actually lived here. Everything in its place, nothing out of line, a couch that had never been slept on, a table without a single mark. Even the air felt still, controlled, like chaos had never been allowed in. And I realized then that I did not know where to go. There was no obvious place for someone like me. In a room like this, no corner that felt safe or familiar, just open space and quiet expectations. Sit, Adrian said, not pointing, not directing, just a single word. But it carried enough weight that I found myself moving toward the couch without questioning it, lowering myself carefully, every movement slow, measured, because my body was still reminding me that it had limits, that I could not pretend everything was fine just because the world around me looked perfect. The cushions sank, slightly beneath me, softer than anything I had touched in a long time, and for a second I just stayed there, hands resting in my lap, fingers still curled like they had not decided how to relax yet. I could feel his presence even before I looked up, the way he moved through the room without hesitation, like he knew every inch of it without needing to check. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough that it did not feel like pressure, and I realized that distance was intentional. Everything about him was intentional. You need to breathe slower, he said, and I blinked, caught off guard by the statement. Because I had not noticed it myself, had not noticed how uneven my breathing still was, how every inhale came a little too quick, every exhale a little too shallow. I tried to adjust, to follow what he said, but it was harder than it should have been, my body resisting the calm, like it did not trust it yet, like it was waiting for something to go wrong. He watched me for a moment, then stepped closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to make his presence more immediate. Look at me, he said. And I did, because it felt easier than focusing on anything else, easier than focusing on the unfamiliar space, on the quiet, on the fact that I was here at all. He said softly, his tone steady, controlled, and I followed, pulling in a slow breath, feeling it catch slightly before settling. Out, he added, and I let it go, slower this time, more even. We did that a few times, the rhythm simple, repetitive, until something in my chest loosened just enough to make it feel manageable, not gone, not fixed, just quieter. And when I finally looked away, it was not because I had to, it was because I chose to, and that felt like a small victory I did not expect. Better, he said, not as a question, but as an observation, and I nodded, because it was true, because despite everything, despite the confusion, the uncertainty, the fact that I was sitting in a place I did not belong with a man I did not understand, my breathing had steadied. My hands had stopped shaking quite as much, and that mattered more than I wanted to admit. Why? Are you helping me? I asked then, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because it had been there from the moment he appeared, from the moment he answered that message, and I needed to hear something. Anything that made this make sense, Adrian did not answer immediately, and that pause felt deliberate, like he was deciding how much to say, how much to leave unsaid. "You asked," he said finally, the same answer as before. But this time it landed differently. Heavier, more intentional. I frowned slightly, because that was not enough. Not really. People ask for help all the time. I said quietly. You do not show up for all of them. His gaze held mine, steady, unchanging. And for a brief moment, something in his expression shifted again, not softer, not warmer, just more, like there was something behind it he was not letting me see. "No," he agreed simply. And that was all he gave me. No explanation, no justification, just the truth. And somehow that made it harder, because it meant there was a reason, one he was choosing not to share, one that mattered more than the situation itself. I leaned back slightly against the couch, the movement slow, careful, my body still reminding me to take it easy even as my mind kept pushing forward, trying to understand, trying to catch up. "So what happens when I leave?" I asked, the words quieter now, more cautious, because that was the part that mattered, the part that decided everything. Adrian's expression did not change, but something in the air did, something subtle but unmistakable, like a line had just been drawn that I had not seen before. "You are not leaving tonight," he said, calm, certain, the same way he had said everything else, like it was not something that could be argued. And I felt my chest tighten again, not from pain, but from the realization settling in, heavier than before, more defined. This was not temporary. This was not just a moment of help that would fade when the morning came. This was something else, something that had already begun. And as I sat there, wrapped in his coat, in his space, under his control in ways I did not fully understand yet, I realized one thing with quiet, unsettling clarity. I had walked in here on my own, but leaving was not going to be my decision anymore. I should have argued, should have stood up and said no, should have reminded him that I still had a life outside these walls, that I was not someone who could just disappear into a place like this without consequences. But the words did not come. They stayed somewhere behind my ribs, caught between the ache in my chest and the quiet certainty in his voice. And that scared me more than anything else. Not him, not this place, but the fact that part of me was too tired to fight, too worn down to push back the way I normally would. I shifted slightly on the couch, testing the limits of my body again. A slow inhale, a careful adjustment of my shoulders, and the discomfort was still there, dull and persistent, like a reminder I could not ignore. I glanced toward the large windows across the room, the city stretching out below in a blur of lights, everything still moving, still alive, while I sat here in a space that felt completely separate from it, like I had stepped outside of my own life without realizing it. "I have things I need to do tomorrow," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended but steady enough to hold. It was the closest thing to resistance I could manage, a small attempt to reclaim something normal. Adrian did not react right away, and that silence made me more aware of him than any response would have. He walked toward the windows, his hands slipping into the pockets of his coat, his posture relaxed in a way that did not match the weight he carried in every other moment. He looked out over the city like it belonged to him, like every street, every building, every light was something he understood on a level I could not reach. "Tomorrow can wait," he said after a moment, still facing away from me, his voice calm, certain, like he was stating a fact instead of offering an opinion. I felt something tighten in my chest again, not physical this time, something sharper, more immediate. "It cannot," I replied, a little stronger now, because that mattered, because if I let that go, then what was left? "I have a job. I have responsibilities." The words came out quicker, more urgent, like I needed to hear them as much as I needed him to. Adrian turned then, slowly, his gaze finding mine again, steady, unreadable, and for a second I wished he would argue, wished he would push back in a way I understood, because that would have been easier to resist, easier to reject, but he did not. He just looked at me like he was measuring something deeper than the words I had just said. "You will not lose your life because of one night," he said. And there was something different in his tone now, not softer, not warmer, but more deliberate, like he was choosing to meet me halfway in a way he did not have to. I held his gaze, searching for something I could hold onto, something that felt real. "You do not know that," I said, because he did not. Because no one could promise something like that. Not in my world. Not in the one I came from. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. Just slightly. Just enough to make me notice. I do, he said. And there was no hesitation, no doubt. Just certainty. The kind that did not come from hope, but from control, from knowledge. And that realization settled over me slowly, heavy and unavoidable. This was not someone who made promises lightly. This was someone who made decisions and then made them real. I looked down at my hands again, at the way they had finally stopped trembling, at the faint marks where my fingers had pressed into my palms earlier, and I realized how quiet everything had become, how still, like the chaos I had come from had been left outside these walls, unable to follow me in. You keep saying things like that, I murmured, more to myself than to him. Like you can just decide what happens. Adrian did not move, did not look away. I can, he said simply, and that should have sounded arrogant, impossible even, but it did not. Not here, not in this space where everything already seemed to bend around him. I let out a slow breath, leaning back slightly, my body finally giving in to the exhaustion I had been holding off. My eyes drifting toward the ceiling for a moment before closing briefly, just a second, just enough to feel the weight of everything catch up to me. When I opened them again, he was still there, still watching, still present in a way that felt constant, unchanging. What if I do not want that? I asked quietly, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because it mattered, because somewhere inside me, there was still a part that needed to know I had a choice, even if it was a small one. Adrian took a step closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough to make the distance between us feel intentional again. His gaze steady, his voice low, controlled. Then you will tell me, he said, and for the first time since this began, there was something in his tone that felt different, not commanding, not absolute, but something closer to an agreement, something that left space for me to exist inside it, even if I did not fully understand how. I held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something that felt real, something that felt like mine, and then I nodded, just once, because that was all I could manage, because for now, for this moment, that was enough. And as the silence settled again, softer this time, less heavy, I realized something I had not expected. I was still here, still in control of at least one thing. Even if it was just the decision to stay seated on that couch, to breathe a little slower, to not run from a situation I did not understand, and somehow, that felt like the first real choice I had made since the night began. The silence did not feel as heavy anymore, but it did not feel safe either. It felt like something waiting, something steady and watchful, like the room itself was listening to every breath I took. I shifted slightly on the couch, adjusting the coat around my shoulders, the warmth settling deeper now, sinking into muscles that had been tight for too long. And for the first time since I walked in, I noticed how tired I really was, not just physically, but something deeper, something that had been building for months without me admitting it. My eyes drifted again toward the windows, the city still glowing beneath us, distant, almost unreal, like a different life I had been part of only hours ago. Do you ever stop? I asked without thinking, the question slipping out before I could decide if it made sense. Adrian's gaze shifted slightly, not surprised, just curious, like he was cataloging another unexpected detail about me. Stop what? He asked, and I exhaled softly, trying to find the right words, because it was not just one thing, it was everything. Watching, deciding, controlling everything around you. I said, my voice quieter now, but more certain, because I had seen it, felt it in every moment since he stepped out of that car. He did not answer right away, and for a second I thought he might ignore it, might let the question fade the way others had. But then he moved, slowly, crossing the space between us until he stopped near the edge of the couch. Not sitting, just standing there, close enough that I could feel the shift in the air again. No, he said finally, simple, honest, and there was something in that answer that caught me off guard. Not the word itself, but the lack of hesitation, the absence of anything hidden behind it. I tilted my head slightly, studying him the way he had been studying me, trying to understand something that did not fit into the world I knew. That sounds exhausting, I said, and this time there was the faintest hint of something in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close, something that softened the edges just enough to make it human. It is necessary, he replied. And there it was again, that difference, the way he saw things as choices that had already been made, not options to be considered. I leaned back a little more, letting my head rest against the back of the couch, my body slowly giving in to the weight of everything. The quiet, the warmth, the absence of urgency that had defined every moment before this. You do not seem like someone who needs anything, I said after a moment, the thought forming slowly, because everything about him suggested control, independence, a life that did not rely on anyone else. His gaze did not shift, but something in it deepened, just slightly, like I had stepped closer to something he did not usually let people see. Everyone needs something, he said, and the way he said it made it feel less like a statement and more like a truth. He had learned the hard way. I frowned slightly, considering that, because it did not match the image he presented, did not match the way the world seemed to bend around him. What do you need? I asked, and this time I knew I was stepping into something I did not fully understand, but I could not stop myself, because for the first time, this did not feel one-sided. It did not feel like I was the only one being seen. Adrian did not answer immediately, and the silence stretched just long enough to make me think he would not answer at all. But then he took a small step back, creating just a little more space between us, like he needed it, like the question itself required distance, control. He said finally, and the words settled into the room. Heavy, precise, exactly what I expected, and yet different when he said it out loud. I nodded slowly, because that made sense, because I had seen it in everything he did. But there was something else there, something he was not saying, something I could feel even if I could not name it. And what happens when you do not have it? I asked quietly, and this time the shift was clearer, not in his posture, not in his voice, but in the space between us, like I had crossed into something more personal, something that mattered. His gaze held mine, steady, unblinking, and for a second I thought he might shut the conversation down, might pull back into that calm, controlled version of himself, but he did not. Then I take it back, he said, and there was something in that answer that sent a quiet chill through me, not fear. Exactly, but awareness, a clearer understanding of the kind of man standing in front of me. I looked down again, my fingers tracing the edge of the coat absently, grounding myself in something real, something tangible, because this conversation was pulling me somewhere I was not prepared for, somewhere deeper than I had intended to go. You took me out of that street, I said slowly, the connection forming in my mind as I spoke it out loud. Was that control too? Adrian did not look away, did not hesitate. Yes, he said, and the honesty of it hit harder than anything else he had said, because there was no attempt to soften it, no attempt to make it something it was not, just the truth, clear and unfiltered. I swallowed, the weight of that settling into me, reshaping everything I thought I understood about this situation, about him, about what this night had become. And as the silence returned, quieter now, more balanced, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. I had not just stepped into his world, I had become part of something he had chosen to take, and the difference between those two things was something I was only beginning to understand. The word stayed with me longer than it should have. Control, not just because he said it, but because of the way he said it, like it was not something he wanted, but something he lived by, something he depended on the way other people depended on air, and I could not decide if that made him safer or more dangerous. I shifted slightly, pulling the coat tighter around me again, my fingers brushing the fabric as if it could anchor me to something real, something familiar, but there was nothing familiar about this, not the room, not the quiet, not him, and yet I was still here, still sitting across from a man who admitted, without hesitation, that he had taken control of the situation I had fallen into, and somehow that honesty made it harder to push back, harder to reject. You say that like it is normal, I said after a moment, my voice steady but quieter now, because the weight of the conversation had shifted. It was not just about what had happened anymore, it was about what it meant. Adrian did not move, did not look away. It is normal, he replied, and there was no arrogance in it, no need to prove anything, just a simple statement of fact. I let out a slow breath, leaning back again, my body relaxing slightly despite my mind still trying to keep up. Not for me, I said, and this time there was no hesitation in my voice, because that was the line I understood, the boundary I still held on to. His gaze softened, just barely, The change so subtle I might have missed it if I was not looking for it. I know, he said, and for the first time since I met him, it did not sound like a dismissal. It sounded like acknowledgement, like he understood the difference between us and was choosing not to erase it. And that unsettled me in a completely different way, because it meant this was not accidental. This was not something he was forcing into his version of reality. He was aware of the distance between our worlds, and he had stepped across it anyway. I looked down at my hands again, tracing the faint lines in my palms, grounding myself in something simple, something that belonged to me. Then why me? I asked, the question finally forming in a way I could not avoid anymore, because that was the part that did not make sense, the part that kept circling back no matter how far the conversation moved. You said you do not show up for everyone. I continued, my voice quieter now, more careful, because this felt like stepping into something deeper, something that mattered more than the rest. Adrian did not answer right away, and this time the silence felt different, heavier, more deliberate, like he was deciding whether or not to let me see something he usually kept hidden. I held still, waiting, because for once, I wanted the answer more than I feared it. He finally moved, not closer, not farther, just enough to shift the angle of his stance, like he was adjusting something internal before speaking. Because you did not ask like everyone else, he said, and I blinked, caught off guard by the answer. Because it was not what I expected, not something logical or strategic, just different. I sent a message, I said slowly, trying to understand what he meant. That is all. He shook his head slightly, the motion small but certain. No, he said. You did not ask for a solution. You did not try to explain. You did not negotiate. His eyes held mine, steady, focused. You asked for help. The words settled into me differently this time, deeper, like they were connecting to something I had not fully recognized before. I thought back to that moment, the rain, the pain, the way everything had narrowed down to one simple action, one message, and I realized he was right. I had not been thinking, had not been calculating. I had just reached out, blindly, without knowing who would answer, and somehow, he had. That does not explain why you came, I said, but there was less resistance in my voice now, more curiosity, more need to understand than to push back. Adrian's expression shifted again, not softer, not warmer, but more open in a way that felt rare, like something he did not offer often. Because I could, he said, and for a second, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so simple, so direct, and yet it carried so much more than the words themselves. Because I could, not because he had to, not because there was something to gain, just because he decided it was worth his time, worth his attention, worth stepping into something that had nothing to do with him. I looked away, my gaze drifting back to the city beyond the windows, the lights still flickering in the distance, and I tried to place this, to fit it into something I understood, but it did not fit. It did not follow the rules I knew, and that made it harder to accept, harder to trust. That is not a good reason, I murmured, more to myself than to him, because it felt too fragile, too unpredictable. Adrian did not argue, did not try to convince me otherwise. He simply said, it was enough. And something about that stayed with me, something quiet but persistent, like a truth I was not ready to accept yet. I leaned back again, letting my eyes close for just a second, the weight of everything finally settling into place, not resolved, not understood, but real in a way I could not ignore. And as I opened them again, meeting his gaze once more, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. This was not just about being saved from one moment. This was about being seen in a way I had not been before, and that was something far more complicated than anything I had been prepared for. I did not respond right away after that, because something about his answer stayed with me in a way I could not easily shake. It was not dramatic, not overwhelming, just quiet and persistent, like a thought that kept returning no matter how many times you tried to push it aside. I shifted slightly, pulling my legs in just a little closer, not out of fear, but out of instinct, like I needed to make myself smaller to process everything that had just been said. The room felt different now, not physically, but in the way I noticed it, the stillness, the controlled silence, the absence of anything unexpected. And for the first time, I wondered how long it had been like this, how long he had lived in a space where nothing happened unless he allowed it. Do you ever get it wrong? I asked quietly, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because it felt important, because if everything about him was built on control, then what happened when that control failed? Adrian's gaze shifted slightly, not away, just deeper, like he was considering the question instead of dismissing it. No, he said, and there was no arrogance in it, just certainty, the kind that came from experience, not assumption. I let out a small breath, shaking my head slightly, because that was impossible, because no one could always be right. That is not real, I said, more firmly this time, because I needed something to push against, something that reminded me the world still worked the way I understood it. Everyone gets it wrong sometimes. Adrian did not argue, did not correct me. He simply stepped closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to make his presence more immediate, more grounded. I do not act until I know the outcome, he said, and the words landed differently than I expected, not defensive, not dismissive, just precise, like a rule he followed without exception. I frowned slightly, trying to understand what that meant, because it sounded impossible, like something no one could actually do. That does not make sense, I said, my voice softer now, more thoughtful than resistant. You cannot know everything. His expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes that suggested I was missing the point. I do not need to know everything, he replied, only what matters. And that was when it clicked, not fully, not completely, but enough to shift something in my understanding. It was not about control in the way I had been thinking, not about forcing outcomes or dominating situations. It was about choosing carefully, about moving only when the result was already clear, and that realization unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant nothing he did was random, nothing he chose was uncertain, including me. I looked down. Again, my fingers tightening slightly in the fabric of the coat, because that thought carried weight, more than I wanted to admit. So you knew. What would happen when you answered me? I asked, the question quieter now, more cautious, because I was not sure I wanted the answer. Adrian did not hesitate this time. Yes, he said, and the simplicity of it made my chest tighten, not from fear, but from the clarity of it, from the realization that this was not a coincidence, not an accident. This was something he had stepped into fully aware of what it would become. You knew I would come with you? I pressed, because that was the part that mattered, the part that felt too close to something I was not ready to name. His gaze held mine, steady, unwavering. I knew you would not stay there, he said, and something about that answer hit differently, because it was not about him, not about his control. It was about me, about what I would do, about what I had already shown him without realizing it. I swallowed, the weight of that settling in slowly. You do not know me, I said, but the words felt weaker than I wanted them to, because part of me knew he had seen something, something I had not fully understood myself. I know enough, he replied, and there was no hesitation, no doubt, just quiet certainty. I looked away again, my gaze drifting toward the city lights, trying to ground myself in something familiar, something that belonged to my world. But even that felt distant now, like it was fading further away with every passing second. That is not fair, I murmured, the thought slipping out before I could stop it, because it was not. It was not fair that he could see things I could not, that he could decide things before I even understood them. Adrian did not respond right away, and when he did, his voice was quieter than before, not softer, just more measured. Fair is not always relevant, he said, and that answer should have frustrated me, should have made me push back, but instead it just settled, like another piece of a reality I was slowly being pulled into. I leaned back slightly, letting my head rest again, my eyes closing for just a moment as I tried to process everything, the weight of the conversation, the way it had shifted from simple questions to something deeper, something more complicated, and when I opened them. Again, he was still there, still watching, still present in a way that felt constant, unchanging. Then what is relevant? I asked quietly, because if fairness did not matter, then something else had to, something that guided everything he did. Adrian did not look away, did not hesitate. What happens next? He said, and the way he said it made it feel less like a concept and more like a direction, like something already in motion. And as I sat there, wrapped in his coat, in his space, under the quiet weight of his attention, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. Whatever happened next was not something I was going to fully control, but it was something I was already part of, whether I understood it or not. The question lingered between us, heavier than anything else that had been said. What happens next? It sounded simple, almost harmless, but the way he said it made it feel like something already decided, something already in motion, and I realized I was waiting for his answer even before he spoke, waiting in a way that felt unfamiliar, like I had stepped into a rhythm that was not mine. I shifted slightly on the couch, my body reminding me again that it had limits, a dull ache settling deeper. Now that the adrenaline had faded, and I pressed my hand lightly against my side, more instinct than thought, Adrian noticed, of course he did, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second before returning to my face. "You should not ignore that," he said, his voice calm, but more focused now, less conversational, more precise. I let out a small breath, shaking my head slightly. "It is fine," I replied automatically, the words coming out of habit more than truth, and I knew he heard the difference. I could see it in the way his expression shifted just enough to register it. "It is not," he said, not sharply, not forcefully, just final, like he was stating something that did not need to be argued. I looked away, my gaze dropping to the floor, because arguing felt pointless again, because part of me already knew he was right, even if I did not want to admit it. "I do not need a hospital," I added, quieter now, because that was the part that mattered. The part that felt like a line I needed to hold. Adrian did not move right away, and that pause felt deliberate, like he was choosing his next step carefully. "You are not going to a hospital," he said, and that caught my attention immediately, my head lifting slightly as I looked back at him, searching for what he meant, because if not a hospital, then what? Then what? I asked, the question sharper than I intended, because uncertainty was easier to react to than control. He stepped away from the couch, moving toward a door I had not noticed before, blending seamlessly into the wall like everything else in this place. He opened it without hesitation, and the light inside was softer, warmer, different from the rest of the space. "I have someone here," he said, glancing back at me. And there was something in his tone now that I had not heard before, not softer, not warmer, but more considered, like this was something he had already arranged, something that had been part of the plan from the beginning. I stayed where I was for a second, processing that, because it meant this was not just a place to rest. This was something prepared, something intentional, and that realization settled into me slowly, shifting everything just a little further. "You planned this," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. But he heard it anyway. "Of course he did. I plan everything," he replied simply, and that should not have surprised me, not after everything he had already said, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real, more defined. I pushed myself up slowly from the couch, my movements careful, measured, because my body was still reminding me of its limits, and I hated that, hated how aware I was of it, how little control I had over something so basic. Adrian did not move to help me this time, and I noticed the way he allowed me, the space to stand on my own, to take those few steps forward without interference, like he understood that this part mattered, that I needed it to feel like mine. I followed him toward the open door, the light inside growing clearer as I approached, revealing a room that felt different from the rest of the apartment, more personal, more lived in, though still controlled. In a way I was starting to recognize. There was a faint scent of something clean, something clinical but not cold, and for a second, I hesitated at the threshold, because stepping inside felt like crossing another line, another point of no return. "Emily," he said again, not urging, not commanding, just enough to bring my attention back, and I looked at him, searching for something I could not quite name, something that made this feel less like I was being moved and more like I was choosing to move. "You said I could tell you if I did not want something," I said, my voice steady despite the tension in my chest, because that mattered, because I needed to know that part was still true. Adrian held my gaze, his expression unchanged but his attention sharper now, more focused. "Yes," he said, simple, direct, leaving no room for misunderstanding. I took a small breath, feeling it settle more evenly than before, and nodded once, because I did want to know what came next, because despite everything, despite the uncertainty, the control, the way this night had unfolded, I was still here, still making that choice. And as I stepped into the room, the door closing softly behind us, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else. Whatever happened next was not just his decision anymore. It was something I was choosing to face, even if I did not fully understand where it would lead. The room felt quieter than the rest of the apartment, not empty, but contained, like every sound had been softened before it could reach the walls, and I paused just inside the doorway, taking it in without fully meaning to. A bed positioned neatly against one side, a chair near the window, a small table with items arranged in a way that felt intentional rather than decorative, nothing excessive, nothing out of place, just prepared. And that word settled into my mind again. Prepared, like this moment had been expected long before I stepped into it. I shifted my weight slightly, the movement small but enough to remind me why I was here. The dull ache still present, not sharp, not overwhelming, just persistent, like it refused to be ignored. Sit, Adrian said again, his voice quieter now in this smaller space. And I did, lowering myself carefully onto the edge of the bed. The mattress firm but not uncomfortable, supporting me in a way that felt deliberate, like even this had been chosen with purpose. I kept the coat wrapped around me, my hands gripping the fabric lightly, not because I was cold anymore, but because it gave me something to hold on to, something that felt stable in a situation that was anything but. The door behind us opened again, and I looked up instinctively, my attention shifting toward the movement. A woman stepped inside, her presence calm, composed, her expression neutral but not distant, like she had seen situations like this before, like nothing about this surprised her. She carried a small case in one hand, setting it down on the table with quiet precision before turning her attention to me. "Emily," Adrian said, and I glanced at him briefly, then back at her. "This is Dr. Collins," he added, his tone steady. And there was something in the way he said it that made it clear this was not a suggestion, not an option. This was part of what happened next. Dr. Collins offered a small nod, her gaze meeting mine, not invasive, not clinical in the way I expected, just attentive, like she was waiting for me to meet her halfway. "I'm going to take a look, all right," she said, her voice calm, even, and I hesitated for a second, not because I did not understand, but because agreeing felt like another step. Another layer of this situation I had not planned for. I glanced at Adrian again, not because I needed permission, but because he was there, because his presence had become something I could not ignore. He did not speak, did not move. He just watched, and that was enough. I nodded slowly, turning my attention back to her. "Okay," I said, the word quiet but clear. She stepped closer, her movements careful, measured, like she was aware of every inch of space between us. Like she understood that this was not just physical, this was something more, something that required trust, even if it was only temporary. She asked a few questions, simple ones, where it hurt, how long it had been like this, things I could answer without thinking too much, things that kept me grounded in something real, something practical. I responded quietly, my voice steadier now, less uncertain, because this part made sense. This part one understood. Her hands moved carefully, precise but gentle, never forcing, never pushing beyond what I allowed. And I noticed the difference between control and care, between taking and asking, and it shifted something in me, something small but important. Adrian stayed where he was, near the door, not interrupting, not stepping in, just present, a constant in the background. And I realized that was intentional too. He was giving space, but not distance, allowing this to happen without removing himself from it entirely. After a few moments, Dr. Collins stepped back slightly, her expression thoughtful but not concerned in a way that alarmed me. "You are going to be all right," she said, her tone steady, reassuring without being exaggerated. "But you need to rest, and you need to take it easy for a few days." I let out a small breath I did not realize I had been holding, the tension in my shoulders easing just a little, not gone, but less immediate. She gave a few more instructions, simple, practical things that grounded me further, that made this feel less like a situation I had fallen into and more like something I could navigate, something I could understand. When she finished, she looked at Adrian briefly, a silent exchange passing between them that I did not fully understand. And then she gathered her things, moving toward the door without unnecessary words, without lingering. Like her role here had been clear from the beginning. The door closed softly behind her, and the room settled into silence again. quieter than before, more focused. I looked down at my hands for a second, then back up at Adrian, who had not moved, had not shifted, still watching, still present in that same steady way. "You planned that too," I said quietly, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what had become obvious. He did not deny it, did not explain it. He simply said, "Yes." And something about that felt different now, not as unsettling as before, not as overwhelming, just expected. I adjusted the coat slightly around my shoulders, leaning back just a little more against the bed, my body finally starting to accept the rest it had been resisting. And as the silence settled again, softer this time, less heavy, I realized something that shifted everything just slightly. This was no longer just about what had happened to me. It was about what was happening now, about the space I was in, the choices I was making, and the man standing in front of me who had decided, for reasons I was only beginning to understand, that I was not going to face any of it alone. The silence after the door closed felt different this time. Not heavy, not uncertain, just settled, like something had shifted without either of us needing to say it out loud. I adjusted slightly against the pillows, my body finally giving in to the rest it had been resisting. The ache still there but quieter now, more manageable, and for the first time since the night began, I realized I was not bracing for something to go wrong. I was just there, breathing, existing in a space that did not demand anything from me. And that felt unfamiliar in a way I could not ignore. I glanced up at Adrian, still standing where he had been, still watching, but not in the same way as before. There was something different in it now, less like he was assessing, more like he was waiting. "You can sit, you know," I said, the words coming out before I could second-guess them, because the distance between us felt unnecessary now, because standing there made him feel like something separate, something untouchable, and for some reason, I did not want that anymore. He did not move right away, and for a second I thought he might ignore it, might stay exactly where he was like he had done with everything else, but then he stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, and sat in the chair near the bed. The movement controlled but not distant, and that alone shifted something in the room, made it feel smaller, more contained, like we were no longer standing on opposite sides of something undefined. I let out a small breath, my shoulders relaxing just a little more. "You do not have to stay," I added after a moment, not because I wanted him to leave, but because I needed to say it, needed to know that part still existed, that this was not something forced. Adrian's gaze held mine, steady, unwavering, and for a second I thought he might give me one of those simple answers again, something direct, something that closed the conversation instead of opening it. But he did not. "I know," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear he understood what I meant, not just the words, but the reason behind them. I nodded slightly, because that was enough, because I did not need him to explain it. Not right now. The silence returned again, softer this time, more comfortable, like it belonged here instead of pressing against the walls. I shifted slightly, adjusting the position of my arm, testing the movement, and it was easier. Now, not perfect, not without discomfort, but better, and I noticed the difference in a way that felt grounding, like something had actually changed. "Thank you," I said quietly, the words simple but real, because they needed to be said, because despite everything, despite the confusion, the questions, the way this night had unfolded, he had been there, he had answered. Adrian did not respond right away, and when he did, his voice was lower, more measured. "You do not owe me anything," he said, and that should have been reassuring, should have made this feel lighter, but instead it did the opposite, because nothing about him suggested he did things without reason, without purpose. I studied him for a moment, the way he sat, the way he held himself even in stillness, like control was not something he turned on and off, it was just there, constant. "That is not how this works," I said softly, because it was not, because people did not just show up, did not just change the course of someone else's night without expecting something in return. His gaze did not shift, did not soften, but there was something in it that felt more open than before. "It is how I choose for it to work," he replied, and there it was again, that difference, that way he saw things not as rules to follow but as decisions to make. I leaned back slightly, letting my head rest more comfortably, my eyes drifting for a second before returning to him. "You keep deciding things for both of us," I said, Not accusing, not challenging, just stating what had become clear. Adrian did not deny it, did not correct me. He simply said, "Then tell me what you decide." And the words landed differently than anything else he had said, not because they were louder or stronger, but because they left space, real space, for me to exist in the situation, for my choices to matter in a way I had not expected. I held his gaze for a moment, longer than before, searching for something that felt real, something that felt like it belonged to me. And for the first time since this began, I did not feel like I was trying to catch up. I felt like I was standing on equal ground. Even if it was only for a second, I decided to stay. I said quietly, the words steady, deliberate, because they mattered, because I needed them to be mine. Adrian did not react immediately, but I saw it, the smallest shift in his expression, not surprise, not approval, just acknowledgement, like he understood exactly what that meant. And as the silence settled again, softer now, more certain, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. This was no longer just about being pulled into his world. It was about choosing to stand in it, even if I did not fully understand what that would mean tomorrow. The words stayed in the air longer than I expected, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, like they had weight that neither of us was rushing to move past. I decided to stay. It sounded simple when I said it, but the meaning settled deeper the longer the silence held. I could feel it in the way my chest rose a little slower now, in the way my hands rested more naturally instead of bracing for something that had not happened. I watched him as he absorbed it. Adrian did not interrupt, did not question, did not turn it into something bigger than it was, and somehow that made it feel more real, more final, like the choice had landed exactly where it needed to. He leaned back slightly in the chair, the movement subtle, controlled, but there was a shift in it, something quieter, less guarded, like he was no longer measuring the distance between us. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding, my shoulders easing just a little more into the mattress behind me. The room felt different again, not because anything had changed physically, but because something between us had, something unspoken but understood. "You said you knew what would happen," I said after a moment, my voice softer now, less guarded, because the question felt different now, less like resistance and more like curiosity. Adrian's gaze remained on me, steady, attentive. "I knew you would not stay where you were," he replied, and I nodded slightly, because that part made sense now, more than it had before. I shifted my head just enough to look at him more directly, studying the way he held himself, the calm certainty that never seemed to leave him. "But you did not know I would stay here," I added, and this time there was something in my voice that felt like ownership, like I was drawing a line that belonged to me. Adrian's expression changed, just slightly, the smallest acknowledgement. "No," he said, and there was no hesitation, no attempt to claim something he had not controlled, just the truth, and that mattered more than I expected, because it meant this part, this moment, was mine. I let that settle, let it take shape in a way that felt steady instead of uncertain. "Then maybe you do not know everything," I said quietly, and there was the faintest hint of something in my tone, not defiance, not challenge, just balance. Adrian held my gaze for a second longer, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded, not a concession, not a surrender, just an acknowledgement of something that had shifted between us. And that small movement carried more weight than anything else he had done. I felt it in the way my chest eased in, the way the tension that had been sitting there since the beginning finally loosened just enough to let something else in, something lighter, something closer to calm. I adjusted the coat again, pulling it slightly tighter around me, not because I needed the warmth anymore, but because it had become something else, something grounding, something that connected this moment to the one before it, to the street, the rain, the message that had started everything. "I still do not understand why you came," I said after a moment, the question softer now, less urgent, because it no longer felt like something I needed answered immediately. Adrian did not respond right away, and this time the silence felt different, not heavy, not deliberate, just thoughtful, like he was considering the question instead of deciding whether to answer it. "Because you asked," he said finally, and I almost smiled, just a little, because it was the same answer, the same simple truth he had given me before, but it felt different now, less like a deflection and more like something real, something that did not need to be complicated to matter. I let my eyes close for a brief moment, just long enough to feel the quiet settle fully around me, the absence of urgency, the absence of fear, the absence of everything that had defined the night before this. And when I opened them again, he was still there, still watching, still present in that same steady way, but it no longer felt overwhelming. It felt constant, in a way that was unfamiliar but not unwelcome. What happens tomorrow? I asked quietly, the question softer than the ones before it, because tomorrow felt different now, less like something I needed to return to and more like something I needed to understand. Adrian did not look away, did not hesitate. Tomorrow, he said slowly, like the word itself carried weight. You decide again. And that was not what I expected, not a plan, not a direction, just a continuation of the choice I had already made. I studied him for a second, the way he said it, the way he left space for something I did not expect to have, and I nodded, slowly, because that made sense in a way nothing else